The tension in the federal courthouse was palpable that morning, as Judge Harrison, known for his controversial rulings against conservative defendants, took his seat at the bench. His reputation had preceded him, but today his actions would cross a line that even the most seasoned attorneys had come to dread. Harrison was not just a judge. In his mind, he was a law unto himself, wielding his power as though it were absolute. As the room filled with murmurs, it was clear that something more than the usual courtroom drama was about to unfold. From the very moment Harrison stepped into the courtroom, he made his control known. Not only did he dictate the temperature of the room, demanding the thermostat remain at exactly 67 DGF, but he also imposed ridiculous restrictions on the lighting. "Adjust the lights," he barked at the bailiff. "I don't want any distractions, and if anyone is too cold, they can bring a coat. My courtroom, my rules." It wasn't just about temperature. It was about control. He enjoyed the feeling of absolute authority over the proceedings, and it showed in the way he treated the staff, the lawyers, and anyone unfortunate enough to cross his path. But it wasn't just the trivial demands that defined Harrison's abuse of power. As the session began, his contempt for those who opposed him became glaringly obvious. When the gallery, filled with conservative supporters, settled into their seats, Harrison turned to face them with a sneer. "Clear the front row," he commanded. "I don't want to see your Trump pins. Move them to the back, where they can remain out of my sight." It wasn't simply about maintaining decorum. It was a clear statement of disdain for anyone who didn't share his political views. His actions were not just a manipulation of the courtroom, they were an exercise in humiliating those who stood against him. The room fell into a nervous silence as Harrison's behavior escalated, but there was no one to challenge him. His power seemed unchecked, and no one dared question his authority. That is, until Pam Bondi entered the courtroom. As Bondi made her way to the front, the energy shifted. Harrison, who had been basking in the comfort of his dominance, now found himself facing someone who wouldn't be intimidated by his arrogance. When Bondi introduced herself, Harrison's face twisted into a mocking sneer. "Oh, perfect," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Another blonde conservative princess trying to play lawyer in my courtroom? What's next? Are you going to quote the Constitution at me?" It wasn't just his dismissive attitude toward Bondi that marked his contempt. It was his outright disdain for anyone who didn't fall in line with his ideological stance. The very title of Attorney General meant nothing to him. It was a badge that he believed held no power in his courtroom. He didn't just see Bondi as an opponent in a legal battle, he saw her as a target to be ridiculed and diminished. His sharp, cutting words were aimed not at the legal arguments, but at her personal identity and her position. But Bondi, calm and composed, didn't flinch. She stood tall, facing him with unwavering confidence. "I'm here to present evidence and seek justice, Your Honor," she stated firmly. "Nothing more, nothing less." As the doors to the courtroom swung open, the atmosphere shifted. Pam Bondi walked in, her presence immediately commanding attention. The sharp, calculated click of her heels echoed through the silent room, her demeanor resolute. This wasn't just any other case for her. It was a battle against a system she had spent years defending, a system now corrupted by power and manipulation. Bondi had faced off against formidable opponents in her career, but today she would confront a force more dangerous than any corporation or politician, a federal judge who believed he was untouchable. From the moment she entered, the stark contrast between Bondi and Judge Harrison was impossible to ignore. Where Harrison sat high on his throne of arrogance, Bondi stood tall, a beacon of determination. The hostility between them was palpable. Bondi's eyes briefly met Harrison's as she made her way to her seat, and for a fleeting second, it was as if time slowed. His eyes narrowed, a smug smile playing at the corner of his lips as he surveyed her, another conservative he intended to tear down. The tension hung thick in the air as Bondi silently adjusted her papers, preparing for the storm that was about to unfold. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as Harrison's voice cut through the silence, laden with mockery and disdain. "Well, well, look who's here," he sneered, his tone dripping with condescension. "The so-called Attorney General has decided to grace my courtroom with her presence. What's next? Are you going to lecture me on the Constitution?" His words were sharp, each one designed to strip away her authority and belittle her stature. Bondi remained unfazed. Her face remained neutral, yet anyone who looked closely could see the steel in her eyes. She wasn't here to argue. She wasn't here to play games. She was here for one reason only: to bring justice to the courtroom and challenge the abusive power that had run rampant for far too long. Her voice rang out clearly, calm yet filled with purpose. "I'm here to present evidence and seek justice, Your Honor. Nothing more, nothing less." Bahara, sensing her confidence, leaned forward, intent on escalating the conflict. "Justice? Is that what you call it? More like another conservative sob story, Miss Bondi," he retorted with a mocking laugh, clearly dismissive of her professional demeanor. His mockery was not just aimed at her legal arguments but at who she was, a woman who dared to challenge him. Bondi's hand tightened around the documents in front of her, a subtle sign of the storm building inside. This wasn't just about the case before them. It was personal. It was about every time a powerful figure had used their position to crush the truth. Every time someone like Bondi had been silenced in the name of expediency or politics. And she knew, no matter how much Harrison mocked her, this time she wasn't backing down. There was a deep personal conviction that fueled Bondi's resolve today. She had faced countless challenges in her career, including being under intense political scrutiny and having to fight for the very laws she believed in, but it was an earlier case, one that had stayed with her, that now fueled her fire. She had once fought for a small business owner whose life was destroyed by a biased judge's unfair ruling, and though the case was dismissed, she'd never forgotten the look of defeat in her client's eyes. The injustice she witnessed back then had sparked a fire within her, a fire that now blazed fiercely as she faced down a judge who thought he could control the courtroom with his arrogance. This was no longer just about legal procedures. This was about standing up to corruption and defending the truth. The growing animosity between Bondi and Harrison was undeniable. As Harrison sneered at her, trying to provoke her, Bondi's steady gaze never faltered. She knew that today she wasn't just battling a judge, she was fighting for every person who had ever been silenced by the system. The moment was bigger than just this courtroom, bigger than just the case at hand. This was about fighting back against an unchecked power that had long been allowed to thrive without consequence. As Harrison prepared to make his next move, Bondi's mind was already 5 steps ahead. She wasn't here for a show, she was here to win, and she would do whatever it took to make sure that justice was finally served. The courtroom was electric with tension as Pam Bondi stepped forward, prepared to present the evidence she knew would expose the truth. The quiet hum of whispers that filled the room suddenly died down as she reached for her briefcase, the sound of papers being shuffled the only noise. She could feel Harrison's gaze on her, an unsettling pressure, but she remained composed. This wasn't her first battle. Bondi had fought in high-stakes cases before, but the stakes today were higher than she'd ever imagined. Harrison's expression tightened as Bondi laid out the first piece of evidence, the financial records that clearly showed Mrs. Henderson's charitable foundation had followed all proper procedures. The room grew still as she calmly presented the documents, her hands steady as she pointed to the relevant sections. Harrison's eyes narrowed in disdain, but he didn't say a word, not yet. He leaned forward in his chair, hands gripping the sides of the bench as if he could will the truth away. Then, the moment Bondi had anticipated arrived. Harrison spoke, his voice dripping with contempt. "Is this what we're doing now, Miss Bondi?" he sneered. "You've come into my courtroom with this nonsense. These records don't matter." His voice became louder, sharper, filled with venom. "Do you think I'm blind? Do you think I don't see what this is? You're just another conservative with a grudge, trying to hide behind your so-called evidence." Bondi didn't flinch. She had expected this. Harrison's response was predictable. He was trying to bully her, to intimidate her into submission. But she wasn't the kind of person to back down. Not anymore. Her eyes locked with his, and for a split second the power dynamic shifted. She could feel the eyes of the entire courtroom on her, waiting for her next move. "This is evidence, Your Honor," Bondi said, her voice calm but unyielding. "It's factual, it's legitimate, and it's been acknowledged by your own office." She paused for a moment, allowing the weight of her words to hang in the air. She knew the facts were on her side, and that was the one thing Harrison could never take away. Harrison's face turned a deep shade of red, his jaw tightening as he snapped back at her. "I don't care what your precious evidence says, Miss Bondi," he growled. "You're wasting my time, and I'll make sure you regret this." The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud. Bondi could feel the intimidation in his words, but she was not one to be intimidated. She wasn't here to back down. She had one goal, to bring the truth to light, no matter how much power Harrison thought he had. "You'll regret nothing," Bondi replied with quiet confidence, "because your decision today, Your Honor, will be remembered, and not just by me, but by anyone who believes in justice." Harrison stood up abruptly, his face contorted with anger. "You want to lecture me on justice?" he spat. "I've been a judge longer than you've been practicing law, Miss Bondi. Do you think you can intimidate me with your so-called evidence and your constitutional lectures?" Bondi's voice remained steady, but there was a sharpness to it now that was impossible to ignore. "You're not the law, Your Honor. You're a man, and today you will answer for your actions." Harrison's fingers trembled as he gripped his gavel, ready to strike it down, but Bondi's gaze never wavered. Her heart beat steadily as she reached into her briefcase again. This time, she produced a sealed envelope, the contents of which would change everything. "Exhibit B, Your Honor," she said, her tone measured. This, too, was part of the discovery process. "But it seems it's been conveniently misplaced. Perhaps your clerk can explain why it wasn't filed?" The room went silent as Harrison's face drained of color. His hand dropped away from the gavel, his eyes darting to the envelope on the table. His jaw tightened, and for a brief moment his control faltered. Bondi continued, her voice unwavering. "This document, Your Honor, shows a pattern of missing evidence. Evidence that would clear my client's name. Evidence that you've seen fit to remove from the court records. And if I'm not mistaken, your clerk has been instructed to seal and destroy this evidence." Harrison's eyes locked onto Bondi's, his fury bubbling just below the surface. "I don't care what you think you have," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You're out of your depth, Miss Bondi. You don't belong here, and if you keep pushing, I'll have you removed. Do you understand?" Bondi's eyes never left his, her expression as calm as ever. "I understand completely, Your Honor," she said quietly, her voice cold and firm. "But you won't silence me, and you won't silence the truth." The gallery held its breath as Harrison stood up, visibly shaking with rage. He slammed his gavel down in a furious display of authority. "This courtroom is adjourned," he shouted. "I will not tolerate this kind of behavior." But Bondi didn't move. She stood there, calm, resolute, unwilling to back down. She knew this was only the beginning. What Harrison didn't know was that the real fight was just beginning, and he would soon discover that his attempts to silence her would only expose him further. The room was on edge. Every person present could feel the rising tension, but none were prepared for the twist that was about to unfold. Bondi, with a calm confidence that belied the storm swirling around her, reached for the final piece of evidence she had carefully prepared. Harrison's earlier dismissals and taunts had been nothing but noise, but now she had something he couldn't ignore. As Bondi laid down a fresh stack of documents on the table, the gallery's attention was fixed on her. Harrison's eyes narrowed, already steeling himself for the next round of petty accusations. He had dismissed the financial records, the documents he thought were simply a conservative conspiracy. But this time, she wasn't just presenting more paperwork. "This, Your Honor," Bondi began, her voice steady but carrying an edge of certainty, "is the smoking gun." She paused, letting the words sink in. "This is an audio recording, an unedited conversation between you, your clerk, and a third party from Forward Justice Initiative. It's time you answer for your actions." Harrison's face went pale as Bondi activated the recorder, the faint click of the play button cutting through the air like a countdown. As the conversation began, a clear, unmistakable voice rang out, Harrison's own voice, agreeing to meet with the organization in a parking garage late one night, discussing the manipulation of evidence in several conservative targeted cases. The room went dead silent. "You know," Harrison's voice echoed through the room, now unmistakable to everyone present, "we'll need to get those files off the record before we proceed. The judge is already on board, but we don't want any unnecessary scrutiny." The realization hit like a punch to the gut. For the first time in the entire trial, the judge was exposed. He had been coordinating with outside organizations, tampering with cases for his own ideological benefit, and worse, covering it up. Harrison's facade of infallibility was cracking, the walls of his control slowly crumbling in front of the entire courtroom. Bondi didn't flinch as she looked over at Harrison, who was now visibly shaking. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His face contorted in panic as the audio played on, exposing even more damning details of his corrupt actions. His instructions to destroy evidence and manipulate the court's procedures for political gain. Harrison's hands gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning white. He was no longer the imposing figure he had once seemed to be. Now he was nothing more than a man, cornered by his own lies. But Bondi wasn't done yet. "Are you still going to pretend that this is all just coincidence, Your Honor?" she asked, her tone calm but laced with sharpness. She knew she had him. Harrison tried to regain some composure, his voice shaking as he stammered, "This isn't admissible. You can't." But Bondi didn't let him finish. "Actually, Your Honor," she interrupted smoothly, "according to federal law, this conversation, which was recorded legally, is fully admissible. And I have even more to show you." She stood up slowly, almost deliberately, and produced another document from her briefcase. "This, Your Honor, is a signed affidavit from your clerk. She confirms everything in the audio recording." The room was now electric with tension, and Harrison's eyes darted between the documents and Bondi. He was no longer the confident judge, throwing his weight around, but a man unraveling before everyone's eyes. He'd tried to stammer out an objection, but his voice cracked. You're trying to destroy me," he spat. Bondi met his eyes with a steely gaze. "I'm not trying to destroy you, Judge. I'm just showing the truth you've been so desperately trying to suppress." She paused, allowing the silence to hang in the air. Then, just when Harrison thought it couldn't get any worse, Bondi dropped another bombshell. "Before you make any more threats, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady and unwavering, "there's something you should know about the pattern you've been so careful to cover up. You and your colleagues, those of you who've been working in the shadows, coordinating these manipulations, you're not alone. We found evidence linking 7 other judges to this same organization, and we have their names." Harrison's face went ghostly white, his body tensed, and for the first time in the entire trial, he couldn't hide his fear. He had been exposed. He tried to reach for the gavel, but his hand shook so violently that it was as if he couldn't even hold it properly. Bondi wasn't finished. She turned to the gallery, addressing the room with calm precision. "These records are not just about one judge's corruption. They are about an entire network of judicial misconduct that has been operating under the radar, targeting individuals based on political ideologies. This isn't about one case. This is about justice for every victim who has been wrongly treated in this very court." As she finished speaking, a subtle yet powerful shift occurred. The courtroom, once silent with tension, now buzzed with murmurs of disbelief and shock. Even the prosecutor, who had been skeptical of Bondi's strategy, looked on in stunned silence. Bondi paused, letting the room absorb her words. She knew the tide had turned. Harrison's facade of control had shattered. Now, he was just another defendant in a case that could very well ruin him. The walls had closed in. Harrison's gaze darted nervously around the room as if looking for an escape, but there was no way out. His authority was gone, and in its place stood a woman who had come to this courtroom not to play by the rules, but to remind everyone that justice is stronger than power. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric, the tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. Bondi had just dealt her final blow, and Harrison was visibly crumbling. His face, once flushed with rage, now turned an alarming shade of pale as the truth poured out, piece by damning piece. But just when it seemed like Harrison might finally have nothing left to say, Bondi made her next move. A move that would change everything. Before Harrison could compose himself, Bondi's phone buzzed softly on the table. The courtroom fell silent as she glanced at the screen. Her fingers tightened around the device. Something had shifted. This wasn't just about the evidence she had already presented. Something bigger was coming. Bondi stood up, her calm demeanor unwavering, as she glanced toward the back of the courtroom. Without warning, she raised her voice, addressing the judge with calculated precision. "Your Honor, I have one more piece of evidence to present. It seems that we've only scratched the surface of what's been hidden here." Harrison's face twisted in confusion. "What is this?" he barked. "Another one of your so-called revelations? You've already made your point." But Bondi wasn't done. She paused for just a moment, allowing the silence to linger before delivering the bombshell. "You see, Judge Harrison," she said, slowly pulling out a sealed envelope, "this document didn't come from me. It wasn't handed over by any of your staff. This document was leaked, not by me, but by someone in your own office." The courtroom shifted uneasily as Bondi held the envelope up high, letting the weight of her words sink in. The audience could feel the tension rise. Something was coming. This wasn't just about the judge's actions. It was about a deeper, more dangerous conspiracy that had been brewing in the shadows. Harrison's eyes flitted nervously to the envelope, then back to Bondi, his body stiffening as his hand hovered uncertainly near the gavel. "What is this nonsense?" Harrison spat, his voice cracking with growing panic. "You're fabricating this." Before he could finish, the door to the courtroom swung open with a loud bang, and in walked a team of FBI agents. Their presence was sudden, their movements deliberate, and the sight of them immediately sent a ripple of shock through the room. The agents, dressed in dark suits, their badges gleaming under the bright lights, walked toward the front of the room with an air of authority that made Harrison visibly flinch. Harrison's eyes darted from one agent to the next, his hands now shaking as he tried to regain his composure. "What is this?" he shouted, his voice rising in a shrill pitch. "What is this supposed to be? This is my courtroom. You can't just—" But his words were drowned out as the lead FBI agent stepped forward. "Judge Harrison, you are under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and the destruction of federal evidence," the agent announced, his voice clear and firm. "You will be taken into custody immediately." Harrison's face twisted in horror. He stumbled back from the bench, his hand gripping the gavel as though it could somehow save him. His entire body shook as he tried to process what was happening. His worst fears were now coming true. Everything was slipping through his fingers. "No, this is a mistake. You can't do this," Harrison yelled, his voice frantic as his eyes bounced between Bondi and the agents. "I'm a federal judge. I have immunity. You can't—" But Bondi stood there, unflinching, her gaze steady as she watched the FBI agents move toward Harrison. The scene that had unfolded before her was not just about exposing a single corrupt judge. It was the unmasking of an entire network of deceit and manipulation. And now, the FBI was here, making sure that justice would be served. As the agents reached Harrison, they quickly grabbed his arms, pulling him away from the bench. Harrison's protests grew louder, but they were met with stone-faced silence. His hand trembled as they slapped handcuffs on him, the weight of the cuffs sinking in as he realized that his reign of terror was finally over. The gallery remained still, shocked by the sudden turn of events. Bondi, however, stood tall and resolute. She had known this moment would come. It wasn't enough to just expose Harrison's actions. The truth needed to be enforced, and now it was happening. The FBI's intervention had taken it out of her hands and into the realm of official action. As Harrison was escorted from the courtroom, his face red with anger and humiliation, Bondi turned to face the courtroom. She took a deep breath, her voice clear as she addressed the room one last time. "What happened here today is bigger than one man's actions," she said. "It's about a system that failed, but it will no longer remain broken. Today, justice was served." The gallery erupted into murmurs of disbelief and awe, but Bondi's gaze was unwavering. She had exposed the truth and ensured that it would be carried out, no matter how high the stakes, no matter how much power had been behind the corruption. As the agents led Harrison away, Bondi felt a weight lift from her shoulders. This was only the beginning. The investigation was just getting started, and with it, the truth would keep unraveling, piece by piece. Bondi's actions had triggered a chain reaction, and the world would now know that justice wasn't just a legal term. It was a living, breathing force that couldn't be ignored. As the door to the courtroom swung shut behind the FBI agents, the sound echoed through the silence that followed. Harrison, now in handcuffs, was led out, his head bowed in shame, his once confident posture reduced to a defeated slump. But as the agents moved him away, the sense of victory in the room was palpable. Not just for Pam Bondi, but for everyone who had been waiting for justice to be restored. Bondi stood at the front of the room, her gaze steady and calm. The fight wasn't over yet, but this was the moment when everything had changed. The battle she had waged against a corrupt system, one that had seemed invincible, protected by the very powers meant to uphold the law, had shifted in her favor. The truth had finally come to light, and for the first time in a long time, it felt as though justice might actually prevail. As Bondi turned to leave the courtroom, the murmurs of the gallery grew louder. What started as a whisper had now spread like wildfire, and the people were beginning to understand the true cost of the corruption that had poisoned the system for so long. Justice wasn't just a legal principle anymore. It had become a collective responsibility. It was the duty of every individual to stand up when the system failed them, and today that was exactly what happened. Outside the courthouse, the scene was nothing short of historic. Protesters had gathered not just in opposition but in support, chanting, waving signs, and calling for a fairer, more transparent judicial system. The streets were filled with voices, united in their demand for accountability and reform. What had begun as a small act of courage by one woman had sparked a movement that was now sweeping through the streets, igniting the passions of those who had long felt silenced. As Bondi stepped into the bright sunlight, she was met by a group of reporters who had gathered outside. Their cameras clicked and flashed, capturing her every move, but she didn't shy away from the attention. She knew this moment was about more than just her. It was about everyone who had suffered under the weight of corruption, those who had been denied justice, and those who had lost faith in the system. "We've seen what happens when we allow the powerful to operate without accountability," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "But today, we've seen that justice can be restored. It doesn't matter how high up you are or how long you've been in power. If you abuse that power, if you twist the system to your advantage, you will be held accountable. This victory belongs not just to me, but to everyone who believes that justice should be blind, that no one is above the law." As Bondi spoke, the crowd around her grew louder, a wave of applause and cheers echoing through the streets. She wasn't just a lawyer today. She had become a symbol of hope for millions of people who believed that change was impossible, but now saw that it wasn't. The fight for justice wasn't over, but this was a defining moment. Later that evening, Bondi sat at her desk, reflecting on everything that had led her to this point. Her phone buzzed with new messages, and as she opened one, a simple sentence caught her eye. It was from a young woman whose father had been wrongfully convicted in a case overseen by one of Harrison's colleagues. The message read, "Thank you for giving us hope again." Tears welled in her eyes as she read those words. This wasn't just about the case. It was about restoring faith in the very foundation of the justice system. The community's rallying support, the letters, the phone calls. It was clear now that the fight had inspired a movement, one that had grown far beyond the walls of the courtroom. And as the evening faded into night, Bondi knew one thing for sure. The journey was far from over, but today, the first real step had been taken. The system had cracked, and it was up to people like her, and like everyone who had stood by her, to ensure that it would never close again. The final words of the trial rang in her ears as she turned off the lights in her office. The system was changing, and Bondi had become not just a part of it, she had become its righteous force, making sure the truth would always find its way into the light.